Welcome to the 19th Real Business of Wine. Tonight we're following a little theme that we started 2 or 3 weeks ago when we invited wine writers, and we had some really top wine writers, including Eric Asimov and Tim Atkin and Elaine Tritton-Brown, talking about writing about wine. Then we had the editors, including Felicity Carter, who's here again tonight. And we had Ray Isle from Food and Wine magazine. And tonight we're looking at stories. And the thing is, there is this mantra today that if you want to sell anything, you have to have a story. And what is a story? What's an interesting story? And that's been alluded to in the other sessions, but various people said, look, please, can we focus on it a bit more? And Polly, I think you've had a number of email questions that have come in for tonight. So I'm looking forward to a lot of input from the participants. But what I'd like to do in a minute is just show a little clip that I picked up from online, and I've edited it to make it slightly shorter.
We make good wine and believe that good retailers and restaurants should be able to sell it.
Okay, let me ask this instead. What are XYZ Wine's key competitive advantages?
Why do you sales folk have to make life harder than it is? I'm offering great wines that impress everyone who tries them. It's that simple.
No, it's not. The wine trade is ultra competitive, so what does your winery do better than the competition? What reasons are you giving consumers to pick up your wine and not someone else's?
Well, that's easy. XYZ Wines offer excellent quality wines from a boutique local and family-owned producer. Being family-owned, we put our heart and soul into the wines, and it's that personal touch that bigger wineries can't offer.
Sure, that's a better answer. But given the number of boutique producers from your region, that's not much of a competitive advantage. And
being small, we really don't have the budget for marketing.
So what you were saying is that your wines are expensive, only 3 places stock them, you don't have a brand strategy, and going forward you don't have a budget to market your wines.
In a nutshell, yes.
They're enough. Thanks for coming in, Deborah, but I don't think we are going to go any further. You seem nice and your wines might be delicious, but my company makes money by selling wine. We are not in the brand building business. In a nutshell, I believe your wines will take more effort to sell than the resulting sales will be worth.
That's not the response I was expecting. How do you ever expect us smaller wineries to be able to grow and compete with the bigger brands if you distributors won't support us? I appreciate your sales focus, but surely our wines have the potential to be good sellers for you.
I have no doubt that your wines have plenty of potential, but at the moment your brand doesn't provide enough unique reasons for people to buy it. It would not make financial sense for us to represent you. My suggestion would be to get out on the road yourself and gain some business around town. That way you could prove to a distributor that your wines already provide ongoing sales. Folks, distributors are contacted by producers like Deborah every week, offering great wines, but not providing enough branding, marketing or previous sales history. The wine trade is serious business, and it takes a lot more than quality wine for wineries to make their mark.
So that's really a picture which that really resonates with me, because I know so many Deborahs, I've met so many of them, and I think all of us have. And I want to throw the ball actually at Felicity to start with, as an editor of a magazine. And we've covered some of this stuff in previous sessions, but not everyone's been here before. But I'm interested in how you see that issue of how does the Deborah in this world actually get over that hurdle, apart from selling some bottles. Now, just for everybody in the audience and in the panel, there's a little scenario that I've put on the chat panel, which you can actually look at, which shows a little couple in France who are making 10,000 cases of wine. And I'm interested to know what maybe we could do to help them. They're an imaginary scenario, but I'd just be interested to know what we might be able to do to help them break through, or people like them. But Felicity, how do you see that what we've just seen, that little video, the simplistic form story Right.
Yeah, no, it's a really big problem, and you know, we get approached all the time by people who want us to tell their stories. The reality is, unfortunately, is that sometimes you need a professional to come in and find what your story is for you. Most of us are very poor advocates for ourselves, so we need an outsider point of view. But yeah, the first thing to do is think about that question about why would anybody be interested in your wine, and that's the thing that people don't think about.
Did Robert freeze? He might have.
He froze. He's completely
That's
frozen.
okay. We can keep going. I want to get through everyone, but I want to address something that you've said in the past quite publicly, Felicity, which is about archetypes, story arcs, and how we can craft a story specifically about the winery, not about the products. Can you just touch on that for a moment?
Okay, so from a literary or a creative point of view, you can't tell a story about an inanimate object because it doesn't do anything. It's one of the reasons why sex stories are usually pretty lousy stories as well, because you can't talk about a thing, however exciting that thing is. You've got to talk about the people around it. So when I've done sort of storytelling workshops, I've gone into some of the research about what we know about storytelling. I've talked about how Hollywood approaches it. And over the times that I've done those seminars, I've actually realized it's completely useless, that most people can't think in those terms, and you need to get a professional to come in and do all of that stuff for you. But what I've discovered that has worked really well is something that I learnt from I've got another life as an editor of romance books. Sometimes I'm a freelance editor, and romance people are interesting because they're always talking about how you can get people to turn the page and to read on, and they're always discussing techniques. And we had a really interesting discussion once about how you get people interested in characters that are you know, unpleasant, or they're boring, or there's some reason why you don't want to engage in them. And one of the romance novelists said, people are absolutely addicted to love. If you can show a character who loves something, we as humans find that very appealing. And so I started doing that in storytelling workshops, where, you know, I'd say to people, why do you love this particular vineyard? Or why did you plant Merlot? What do you love about it? What brought you to love about it? And then they go, well, you know, the first time I was in Paris, I was with my girlfriend and we had a glass of this, and it was the most magical night of my life. And suddenly you've got a story happening. So I think that's my departure point. Either get a professional in to help you unlock what your story is, or think about what is it that you love the most about what you're doing, and talk about that, rather than talk about the passion of what you're doing, which can actually be quite a soulless thing, focusing on an object.
Oh, let's unmute him. Yes, Robert?
So moving across to Tom Lewis, who I've known for a fair few years, who has one identity as the Cambridge wine blogger, in which you review wines and actually do cerebral pieces as well. But your day job is actually in the advertising world, where you're actually in the accountants, the financial account side of that, as I understand it. But
exactly, yeah.
But you see that whole issue of storytelling from within the advertising world every day, don't you? How do you see it applying to wines?
I mean, to me, wine isn't different to any other product that you're trying to sell, except perhaps the structure of the industry is very different. But the principles of what works and human behavior and how you make people interested in your product are identical for wine as they are for anything else. If anything, wine's probably got an advantage. But just to sort of run through a couple of, you know, kind of advertising 101 ideas. The first thing, you know, your product should be meaninglessly distinct rather than meaningfully differentiated. If it's easy to recognize, people will recognize it, and that forms a sort of an affinity, a familiarity. Once you know what that is, that makes it slightly higher in people's minds, in consumers' minds, and therefore they're more likely to want to choose it. You know, interesting things are, why does all wine come in 75 centilitre bottles that generally look the same? You know, if you change the packaging, if you put a funky label on, if you change the bottle size, that then makes your product meaninglessly differentiated. It looks different from every other bottle of wine on the shelf. And as I scan the row of wines that all look the same, I can see one that, oh, that looks interesting. So I might try that. Another sort of, again, key tenet of building, selling stuff is do you build a brand, or do you do sales activation? Do you do discounts? And research has been done that shows you should spend about, to the extent you have a marketing budget and marketing efforts, about 60% of your effort should be on brand building. And what that's doing is building that, telling that story that Felicity was talking about, making your consumers less price elastic, creating additional value in the product beyond just what's in the bottle. About 60% of your effort needs to go on brand building, and then about 40% needs to go on to activation, which is bog offs or competitions or those kind of things. And finding that balance between, because the more you activate, the more you'll make your consumers price sensitive. I think we've all been in the supermarket and seen those brands that are forever discounted, and we ask ourselves, well, why would I ever buy it at the full price? Because it's discounted so often. All it's really doing is training us to buy it at that cheaper price, to think that more expensive price isn't valid. It's just a sort of a premium that's put on top that we're fools if we pay it. We become more price sensitive. So we want to put 60% roughly on brand building, which is reducing the price sensitivity of consumers, and about 40% on activation, because you do need to increase volumes as well.
That actually, before moving on to Tom, of course, that raises a huge issue as to who is deciding this, because speaking personally, my wines, about half the wines that I produce are sold in the US. Our US distributor has decided that as we come out of the crisis we're in at the moment, heavy discounting is going to be required because the market is going to be asking for it. I, as the producer, may not have a say in that any more than if I were in a British supermarket. They may say, to be on our shelves, you have to take part in some of these discounting rituals. But we'll come back to it. But Tom Parnell, you again are the public face of you, I guess, is as an alcohol blogger, Old Parn. But again, you've got a day job that involves selling stuff online. So say a little bit about what you do, and then how you see this from your side.
Yeah, sure. So I'm e-commerce director at a brand called Asprey, which people may have heard of or may not. It's a very old luxury brand, ultra luxury brand on Bond Street, selling products that certainly could not be described in any way as essentials.
With a royal warrant.
Royal warrant holder, and we sell silverware and extremely expensive handbags and that kind of thing. So I think it's a prime example of a brand that could not exist purely on sort of tactical activation of the sort that Tom was referring to. Everything that we do is kind of implicitly built upon the brand story, which has been being accumulated over hundreds of years. I think one point that I wanted to make, I agree strongly with what both Felicity and Tom were saying, is that storytelling doesn't, I think, have to be literal. It doesn't have to be, here's a story, it's in words, it has a beginning, middle, and end, and it's kind of presented in prose. I think some brands tell a story which is totally implicit without ever kind of presenting it to the customer as explicitly a story. And I think that in many cases that can be the better route for a brand to take, because if you don't have the sort of, whether it's in person or written, you don't have that sort of, the charisma to deliver a story really, really well, and B, a substantial different story to tell that has the key ingredients of a good story, and the right arc and all these things, then I think there's limited scope to kind of push that side. I think there are ways of telling a quote story which are sort of more say more visual, more based around kind of creating an image around your brand. You don't have to, I think people sometimes fixate on this idea that I have to tell a story which is structured like a mini sort of short story or something like that. It doesn't have to be like that, I think.
Very interesting. Moving across to Joe, many of you will know Joe Fattorini from The Wine Show, highly successful. In fact, the first really successful wine-focused TV and online series, which is an ongoing one, and Joe's been actually running it from his attic as well recently. But Joe is one of the people who I think does have that charisma of storytelling. But you've also got a very clear idea of how the industry does it. So Joe, over to you.
The young couple next door to me are making a sex tape. They don't know it yet. That's the nub of the most basic story. It's set up, payoff. It's an old Gary Delaney joke. And I spent some time with Jeannie Asprey when we were making the show, the second series. And she was brilliant. She said that there are a lot of stand-up comics now who make a second career out of helping business people to tell their stories. And a bit like Felicity was there saying, if I'd said the couple next door to me are making a sex tape, I'm respecting their privacy and I hope that it never sees the light of day. But it's really boring. And it's just people next door having sex. It's a kind of so what thing. What makes it funny is that it takes a bit of a deviation. And, you know, where Tom was talking there about how it doesn't need to be said in words. It doesn't need to follow Freytag's pyramid and the Shakespearean 5-act structure. I mean, it's really useful if it does. And there are lots of very tactical things you can do to, when you have a twist, when you've got that thing, the sort of grit in the oyster, then there are lots of tactical things and techniques you can use to turn them around. But you can, there's a wine business where the drivers all wore ties. That tells an amazingly brilliant story. There was another company I came across and the guy drove everywhere with his dog on the rear parcel shelf of his car. And people just knew he was the guy who drove everywhere with this Jack Russell sitting on the back. I think a really basic one, if you're a winery and you hand wrote notes to everybody you contacted. And I've talked about, there's quite a few wineries I've been consulting for. And one of the things I say is it's very rarely done. Really easy way of telling a story, handwrite notes to lots and lots of people and find workarounds. So if you can't remember to do the notes, have somebody in your team to sort of rack them up and even to write them and you just need to sign them, but just have these things going out and they will tell this implicit story about who you are and what you do. Within the show, I've learned lots about storytelling there. We have some bits, nobody, it's like that old Howard Gossage line, nobody reads an ad, people read what interests them. Sometimes it's an ad. Nobody reads a brand story. So that thing, I've got an amazing brand story. Nobody reads that. They read what interests them and you are competing not with other brand stories. So don't look at other wineries. Broadly, you're competing with Shiny Floor Telly on a Saturday afternoon. So you've got to find quite universal bits. And within the show, one of our goals is we're allowed to go home if any one of I cry, the producer cries, or the contributor cries. And if we get one of those, then we're allowed to go home. If somebody has burst into tears, and we've had all three, I've burst into tears, James Purefoy cries in series 2, Mel, the producer, cries quite a lot. And I remember making a winemaker cry in Santorini. And, sometimes you've got to slightly manufacture it. This guy had a really bad hip, so we made him walk around all day in this vineyard, and it was really hot, until eventually he sort of started sobbing. But he told this story about how the wine had kept his family alive in the war. Now, like Felicity was there saying, you've got to burrow in and get right. He didn't know that this story of Visanto keeping children alive in the Second World War on Santorini would be the thing. We knew it because we tell stories, and we then knew, let's get him to sob about that.
Joe, I know Polly's got a couple of questions. I just want to quickly pick up on something that you've just said, and that may come back to it. Your couple when making this sex tape, or indeed the ties or the dog or whatever, quite a lot of those are about the stories that are in the heads of the people who are watching. And I think one of the things that we forget is that people make up their own stories, and very often the stories that they tell about our products are more vivid, and it may well be the experience they had with our product. It may be their reaction.
Can I jump in and say
yeah.
something? Unfortunately, we're talking about, brand strategies and marketing strategies and whether you should have an actual story to tell. I actually think it should be made clear that these days you do need an actual story to tell. And the reason is that winemakers and members of the winery at some point have to do the dreaded winemaker dinner, which is a way of selling wine. You've got to have a 10-minute spiel that you get up at a winemaker dinner or in front of a distributor or to a sommelier at a restaurant. I mean, sommeliers now sell completely on stories. So unfortunately, regardless of what you do or how good or how charismatic or uncharismatic you are, you do have to come up with a 10-minute TED talk. And so finding that thing that you can talk about for 10 minutes is really, really important.
Polly, you've got two questions.
I have so many questions for everyone because we work in storytelling at Five Forests. This is a huge focus of what we create for our clients. So let's see, let me do it in order according to my screen. Joe, what you're talking about, the language that we use to describe the dog in the back of the car or the ties or whatever, that's actually branding. Like the branding is your brand is what other people say about you more than what we necessarily want them to say about us. And that's, and I think in my head, that's quite different from the kind of storytelling that Felicity is talking about, where we stand up and we tell a story about the history, which effectively in an e-commerce space is like the About Us page. But then we also have, and I think this is where wine has this big problem, we have our product story. Like, how do we tell the story, the copy, the text that sells a product? And that is often separated from either the About Us stories or the dog in the back of the car. And that's where we get down to sort of features and benefits and what is in it for me. And so I actually would like to go to Tom Parnell, who works in e-commerce all the time, and then over to Tom Lewis to talk about this notion of how do we differentiate between the About Us storytelling and the my product is going to rock your world because storytelling. Tom Parnell first.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's very, very much dependent. I mean, I should say I don't really, I mean, my experience in e-commerce is none of it is wine related, but I do think that it's
good.
Kind of,
that's more important for this.
I think the principles are kind of not exclusive to wine, but I do think, say points that the point that Felicity makes about delivering a spiel in that context, that's not relevant to certain types of products. It's not relevant to the types of products that I generally sell. And so there are clearly requirements for a wine, particularly, that may not be the same as those in the industries that I work in. But if thinking about sort of About Us type page, I mean, that is one of the most visited pages on pretty much every e-commerce site I've managed, and it has to be there. It serves a purpose, kind of establishing trust, establishing authenticity, establishing kind of some of those sort of basic foundational points for someone who's on the site for the first time and just needs to understand that that they're dealing with something legitimate and something that chimes very broadly with what they're looking for on a sort of brand level. And the separation kind of content and then the selling content, I think is very, very dependent on the nature of the product and the nature of the brand. I mentioned Asprey. Asprey's a brand that can trade on that story because most customers coming to the site who are in our sort of very rarefied niche already know the story. We don't really need explicitly to tell them. It's a small segment of customers who are doing research that page exists for. But the knowledge that they already have through sort of that sort of accumulated brand building activity, then sort of that into their purchase decision. But in a brand like the brand I worked at previously, which was Sass & Bell, which is a giftware company at the very other end of the scale, extremely kind of low price point product, the customer is not remotely really interested in the story of Sass & Bell. That the About Us page was actually kind of very sparsely visited compared to majority of other brands. And in fact, someone's much more interested in is this product on trend? Is this answering my specific need right now? I don't really care what the story is behind the founder and why this company exists, because you sell unicorns, I want a unicorn. It's a very simple transactional thing. I think kind of the midpoint, actually, kind of both Sass & Bell and Asprey are kind of extremes, and most brands exist more towards the middle, where there isn't that sort of binary opposite, and you have to look at how you can weave your brand story into your transactional experience, and you're not having this separation between, okay, the About Us page is where all of the storytelling goes, and then the product pages are just where people can purchase. Because I think the best storytelling is the storytelling which is not necessarily kind of, the customer may not be seeking out a story, but they encounter the story serendipitously. They don't realize they're being, they've not signed up for a storytelling session. They've come to buy a product. Most people who arrive on an e-commerce site are there to buy a product. But if you can, as they hit those different touch points, you tell them a story implicitly, I think that is often a better way, and what Joe says about kind of the handwritten note, that's part of e-commerce storytelling, absolutely, bang on. It tells a better and more kind of efficient story than, 200 words of us saying we care very much about our customers. If we can do that, if we can show rather than tell, in part of the e-commerce journey that's actually normally extremely sort of Spartan, then that's fantastic to me. I think it doesn't remove the need to tell the story explicitly somewhere, but I think so long as it's in line with the story your brand is trying to tell on a sort of meta level, and you're not sort of saying on one page, giving in one on one page the impression that you're a very formal brand, and then next thing you're sending handwritten notes. So long as there's not a clash, then I think the two are actually kind of inextricably linked.
Perfect, thank you. So Tom Lewis, going over to you on the advertising side of things, where do you see that spectrum between talking about the story and the heritage? I think in wine, that's where we get hung up, is why we're doing this and why we love it and our passion and our heritage, and the way that we present and position and talk about our products and their impact on your life.
Sure. I mean, in general terms, let me start with McCann Erickson, who famous advertising agency. Their slogan was "The truth well told," and the idea was that the brand story that you tell, it's the truth. It's just the best version of the truth. That's what advertising is, and all the examples that Joe was giving and Felicity's talk about, how you have to give the winemaker story. That's it. That's the truth well told. So what does the truth well told feel like? The thing that everyone's been talking about, I think, really is this idea that emotion trumps reason. We have two ways of thinking in our brain, system 1 and system 2, and one of them is very rational, but it's very slow, and one of them is very quick, and that's our emotions, and that's our sort of lizard brain. So the way advertising works is it connects with us emotionally, not rationally. The more you make advertising rational, in terms of building your brand, the less it works. The more you make it emotional, the more impactful it is. And the most successful adverts have always worked on an emotional basis. To give an example, completely different sector, but the John Lewis Christmas ad, they're always tearjerkers. They're very emotional. Not only are they beautiful old school adverts, but they've also crossed over into the vernacular. That's how powerful that brand is now. That whenever we now wait for the John Lewis Christmas ad to come out. Christmas ads weren't a thing until relatively recently. When other supermarkets do their Christmas ad, the benchmark is always, is it as good as the John Lewis Christmas ad? And then they take it further. The shop displays, you can buy the cuddly toys. The whole thing. It is a huge enterprise. And they've created it. It never, in the same way that, if you think of diamonds as being something that diamonds were not always the traditional wedding ring. That was created. That was an advertising campaign. that relies on a behavioral economics bias called social proof. The more we see other people doing something, the more we think it's the normal thing to do, and therefore we join in. John Lewis has done the same with their Christmas ad. We now talk about it. So, I want to watch it. I want to see it ahead of, at the same time as everyone else. That's what branding does. Those powerful stories not only have an impact on us emotionally, but they also sort of feed that herd mentality that we have, that need we have to share in the same experience. So we all want to do those things. We want to have, buy our wives or fiancés diamond engagement rings, because that's the done thing. That's how branding works.
Holly, you were going to move across to Joe, weren't you, I think?
So I actually have so many questions about this. Joe, your gift is that you add lightness and humor along with the knowledge and the facts to something that can be a very, very dry subject. Sitting across from you on my panel is Tom Parnell, who's very irreverent in how he talks about, or is it fair to say that you yourself are irreverent, or that you find that perhaps the tone is often too serious? And now we have Tom saying engage with emotion, not with reason. But what do we get when we look at a wine? We get technical sheets, we get notes about fermentation, and we get all of this technical knowledge. When you are presenting, Joe, how do you balance the desires of the audience who want to hear that deep technical knowledge with the average Joe who wants to hear the happy, fun, engaging, entertaining stories that you tell?
There is an element of segmentation about it. And, in our rough sort of metrics, about 5% of people are really, really into wine and want to know very detailed stuff. And about 95% of people who are interested in general stories. And, make no bones about it, the wine show's audience is not one that overlaps heavily with decanter, for instance. And actually, very keen wine consumers are very well looked after by wine media. There's an awful lot of it out there. Remember, wine is the most popular drink in every age group and every region of the UK. It's the UK's most popular alcoholic beverage, and the majority of that population is relatively poorly served. And what they're looking for, they don't really know enough about wine to know what the bits are that let them in. So you have to be a bit dog bites man about it. So technical sheets, and like our little case study here in Minervois, all of those stories are all, dog bites man. We need to be man bites dog and twist it around. So when you look at, funny when we're talking about sort of story structure and Freytag's pyramid, when people tell stories about wineries, they universally are very bad Bond films, because there's two variants. One is, my father usually gave me a vineyard, I put money into it, this is my life and passion, and I now make amazing wine that represents who I am. Or, I made an awful lot of money somewhere else and bought a vineyard, I've sunk lots of cash into it, and now it's, it's like James Bond goes, oh, Blofeld, he's the one, let's go and arrest him. And I'll have sex with her at the same time. There's no dip, and it needs to be, it needs to be sort of a comedy. We start off up here, and then, oh, no, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. Whoa, thanks, brilliant, we come out the other end. And then we have Derek Mossman-Knapp, who was in the show in series 1. And Derek's really good. His story starts off with him standing naked in the garden, carrying his 2 children under their arms in the middle of an earthquake. And it's sort of brilliant movie-style opening. He comes up with this amazing idea about supporting people, and it's a total disaster. People losing money hand over fist. He thinks he's gone and lost everything, being helicoptered around South America. Then, eventually, these sort of struggles through and gets to the other end. And I think Felicity's right there, that sense of understanding structure and being able to say, can I distill this? TED Talks, never more than 18 minutes. So you can get between 10 and 18 minutes. Can I distill it down into a story which has a twist? So then when I tell story, that's all one the other night, and it's with Jancis Robinson's glasses. If I go to Richard Brendan and say, tell me about Jancis's glasses, he'll tell me all sorts of stuff about hand blowing them and this, that, and the other. But the story is that they go with every wine. Now, most wine people will say, well, does it direct to the right part of your tongue, and does it capture the aromas, does this, that, and the other? I sort of discovered, whilst ambling through the darker recesses of the internet, that Bertrand Russell had once met Gladstone, the Prime Minister, and had sat next to him at dinner. And apparently, later life, people were fascinated. What was Gladstone like? And all Bertrand Russell could say was that at dinner, Gladstone had turned to him and said, "This is a very good port, but why on earth have they served it to me in a claret glass?" So you've got the greatest philosopher of the 20th century and the greatest sort of politician, and they talk about the glass. Well, if only they'd had a Jancis Robinson one glass, it wouldn't have made any difference. They could have had the same thing. And you get that twist, and it's something that's then relevant to everybody. I mean, not everyone knows who Russell is, but it's finding things from some other part of the world. I'm kind of lucky. I started out making radio on a pirate station called Big Bollock Radio in 1986. And we were irreverent and we mucked about. And I think a lot of storytellers today it's about fear. They're too scared of doing the wrong thing. And behavioral economics is a brilliant example, because behavioral economics broadly is about saying, you know, that thing that you all think is the right thing to go and do, you know, like Tom Lewis was saying there, we're going to do the emotional thing. We're going to turn the emotional button, not the rational one. And it's really hard, particularly now, to go to somebody and say, you know, the entirely rational thing that the spreadsheet says we should do, it's a terrible idea. We should go and do something that's much more emotional. And I think that's what restricts people. So, you know, Wine My Attic potentially is more engaging because what have I got to lose? I was made redundant 3 days before the furlough scheme. I mean, I'm, you know, stuffed. So I might as well just dick about in my attic and have some fun. And I can probably be bolder as a result of that, you know. And on the wine show, are we beholden? You know, one of the things, I remember when we started out, somebody said, hopefully we'll really upset some wine critics. I think an awful lot of wine communication is held back by fear of what the sort of West London bien pensant wine bloggerati will say if you call something slightly different to the rest of them. It's really important. The only reason Oz Clarke was really successful is he was happy to call it differently to everybody else.
Felicity, you've got a story about the IT world and stories, haven't you? I think. Just unmute you.
Just following on from what Joe said, I actually started in advertising as an advertising creative, and we had a couple of IT clients. I think Hewlett Packard was one, and everything that we would do, the client would say, we want something groundbreaking and breakthrough, and then what would end up the other end was this really tedious and boring technical document. And didn't matter how much you tried to be creative, you'd get the technical document. And so eventually I said to them, why are you paying us all this money to come up with these terrible technical documents? And I found out what it was. It was because in the early days of IT, when nobody had any money, the geeks would write to themselves. And so that became the industry standard. It wasn't that anybody wanted it. It was because that's the way they told each other information. And so nobody wanted to change it, because if they changed it, it wouldn't be properly IT. And I think this is true in wine as well, that we have this narrative that people are too scared to get out of. And the narrative goes like this. It goes, I'm from a family-owned winery, and we make wine in the vineyard, and we make our wine with passion. And it's like the IT template. If we move away from that, even though it'll be more interesting, we won't be properly wine people. And I think that's the hurdle to overcome.
I've got a question. Actually, before we go there, Polly, you've got some email questions that came in, haven't you?
I actually wanted to bring in some of the questions. I know that Berta has some questions, and she's with us every night. So if it's okay, I'm going to allow her to come in and ask some of the questions. I know, Joe, you responded to them, but I also think that it would be great to get that so that everybody can hear it and see it. Not everybody follows the Q&A. So did you want to ask your questions that you've put in the Q&A about the second one in particular, about how we want to ourselves relate to the story that we're hearing? Because I think this is a real space where wine and the human beings clash.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Well, I often speak to consumers who have no idea about wine. And I often realize that exactly what you already stated, every one of you, that if it's too technical, you totally lose them. And actually, when you bring in something they can relate to, which means more the smaller things, more things they can recognize themselves in, they easily actually get hooked, whether you do it in a very original way and in an unconventional way, or maybe even in a more classic way. I often experience that. But if you are too like high level and I want to be so different from everything, and originality I experience is a very good thing, but at a certain point, maybe sometimes it's too much. So it's always a kind of balance between telling a story that is really something new, something and something that people can relate to, but not too boring and not too average every day. But I don't know, it's this mixture that is really interesting. But often in the wine industry, I experienced that people want to become the most traditional, the most boring image that they can actually show. And if you try to get them out of that, it's very difficult actually, because they are so used to always tell the same things, that if you want to get the other story out of it, you really have to observe them a lot, and you have to ask them a lot of questions and talk with them a lot and be at their place. And it's quite complex actually. So good storytelling, I guess a few of you already found it, but it's something really complex, and people want to hear, as I said, something more they can identify themselves in. But I don't know what your experiences are with that.
Thank you, Berta. I think, Tom, you were nodding away there. I think you may have some thoughts.
Yep. So I think, I mean, I've worked with quite a few kind of brand owners directly. And I think one thing that you quite often see is that somebody who naturally has a really good, natural, unforced story, as soon as they're put in a position where they realize they're supposed to be telling their brand story, they completely lose the sort of magnetism that they really have, because they go into a mode of thinking, oh, okay, I now have to do this thing, I have to tick these boxes, I have to kind of, you know, trot out this formalized story, when in fact kind of, and that's where I think Felicity's right, that often a professional, a sort of third party who's got that neutral perspective can help sort of to liberate the story that is often there, but people almost kind of, whether it's through fear, which I think is, as people have said, is a very powerful negative influence, or just through kind of a sort of misplaced expectation of kind of what people want to hear. A good story can be totally crushed through, even though there is the raw materials are there to tell it. And I think kind of another thing which I think we all kind of realize, but perhaps hasn't been explicitly stated yet, is that kind of the story is a two-way dialogue, and it's as much about the audience as it is about the teller, and that, you know, when you're talking to somebody or you're writing to somebody, you are kind of, it may be a kind of a one-way exchange in that you're the one who's writing, but you're always thinking, what emotional response, what am I trying to achieve with the other person or people with whom I'm communicating? And I think that consideration, and it might be, it's a sort of flirtatious dialogue, it might be a kind of, you're trying to bamboozle somebody, you're trying to kind of make them laugh, whatever it is, you've got some kind of, there's a vector there which involves the audience. And I think it's very, very important that brands who are telling a story are very clear in visualizing, what is that audience? Who is that audience? Put a face to it. And then what am I trying to provoke in that audience? What feeling do I want to achieve? And I think those kind of questions help to move you away from this sort of rather static, staid kind of, okay, here is my story mode, to a conversation. That sounds a bit trite and cliche to say it's a conversation, but kind of, it is about understanding that you're only one half of the process. Your audience has to kind of meet you halfway. And if you're not even thinking about your audience, then you're kind of off to a bit of a shaky start.
Ollie, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, one of the things that I find really interesting about this in terms of the work that we do is that there is often, I mean, we're surrounded by stories. We are natural storytellers as human beings. We absorb knowledge and we retain knowledge through narrative as opposed to erudition in many cases. So here we are trying to teach something that really is innate to an awful lot of us in our normal everyday lives. But you're right, we get behind a keyboard, we put on our corporate hat, and we just blank out and we lose that. We need it, we feel like we have to learn how to do it. So we, what we found with wineries specifically is that wineries do like to use the traditional sort of archetype stories where they are the hero of the story. You know, oh, these troubles befell us and I inherited this and here's my story. Whereas, you know, what we use with our clients is a formula. We're actually going back to sort of like Star Wars or Joseph Campbell or Lord of the Rings or any of it, is that we and our products, we are Yoda or we are Gandalf. We are the magician who brings the magic to them, and they are actually the hero of the story, so that we're just part of their wonderful story arc. And if we can understand where we fit in and where we can bring that magic and then speak to them on that plane, now we're making our product and ourselves. And of course, Gandalf had a backstory and Yoda had a backstory, but you know, it wasn't about them being on the screen telling us their backstory that made them worthwhile. It was what they could bring to the hero's journey that gave them value. And that's where, just, you know, personally chiming in more on the panelist side than on the moderator side, that's what we see wine struggles to do. We're so in our head. We love what we do so much that we want to talk about ourselves as the hero and set ourselves up really as this silent antagonist with the person who's reading, and they want to see themselves as the hero.
Can I bring Karen Jenkins in, because she's put a point in the chat, which I think it takes us on one stage further, because you've described this situation, both you and Tom Parnell talked about a conversation, but essentially that implies conversation between the producer and the consumer, for example. What happens when we've actually got an intermediary who I'm telling the story to X, and X is then going to be telling my story thereafter. Karen, would you like to ask that, to go through what you were saying? Karen, are you there? Karen Jenkins? Well, I'm going to read it out. Producers are reliant on other people to tell their story, middlemen who they need to facilitate access to consumer, for example, the sommelier. And the story information has to be communicated to them to communicate on your behalf. And that, to me, I think is one of the things that we underestimate the difficulties. And I've heard so many stories being mangled by off-license, by retailers in the shop. And, you know, sometimes the mangled story is better than the original, but it isn't necessarily what the producer wanted to be told. Joe, have you come across that sort of situation? I need to unmute you.
Because didn't I have a go at answering it as well on the...
You did, but do you want to articulate it, because we may not get that on the video, so it's a...
So it's that sort of sense that, because you have to sort of control your story to a degree. I mean, you can't do it very much, but you do have to have some sort of control. I think the more you can structure it, we know that certain stories, they're captured better, people relate them better. You know, people were able to memorize the entire Iliad, you know, by memory and tell it. So I'm sure we can come up with ways, if you use the right techniques, to be able to get a kind of 5-minute story that comes across to people. I know when I started out in the on-trade, I used to go and come up with little stories that you would tell to waiting staff. And you know you've got it if you go in a couple of weeks later and you hear one of the staff telling that story to a customer a bit later on. And sometimes it's very relevant. So with Living Ventures, there was one, and I told them that thing about how on Picpoul de Pinet, on one side of the vineyard is the largest nudist colony in Europe, but on the other side of the vineyard is the largest swingers club in the world. And it was that kind of a place, but it was very relevant to a relatively young, easygoing kind of audience and so on. Now, having worked with FMV, we've similarly gone and told stories. Hambledon was a very good case. You know, Hambledon tells us kind of a story, all about the home of cricket and the soil types. This is all very boring. I mean, sorry if if Ian's watching, but it is kind of boring. What's much more interesting is that the first guy to make sparkling wine at Hambledon was the first guy to make sparkling wine in the United Kingdom, and he was the Queen of Tonga's bodyguard at the coronation. And that gives us a great sense of heritage. So it's relevant, it sort of matters, but it also gives you a mental picture of somebody taking the Queen of Tonga along, and you can flesh it out then. So at a dinner party, you can flesh it out that the Queen of Tonga was the same height and weight as Idris Elba. So now suddenly not only, and you start to build out, and this is quite a televisual thing, that notion of sort of building out an image. So where you start stepping away, I think sometimes watching telly and thinking about telly and seeing how people build telly, being on radio is perfect because you've got to tell those interesting stories and those sort of pictures. But does that sort of answer the question?
I can't. I think Karen's sound is off, but it does for me, I think, definitely.
I think is so interesting about this. Hold on, about this and what we're hearing from everyone, something that I just find fascinating is that time and again, what we're hearing tonight is that a good storyteller is a well-rounded person. And one of the things that, you know, you see in the creative industries especially is they teach you read and study and learn and read about all sorts of things, read about things that you had no idea you were interested in, like just pick it up and learn as much as you can because you have no idea where you might find inspiration. So what we're asking is this sometimes very tunnel visioned industry to know, you know, to become really well-rounded and interested in all of the stories that go on around them and intersect and are tangential.
Can I bring in a friend, an old friend of mine, Adrian Atkinson, who I've known from when he was both back in the days of working in the Oddbins chain in the UK. I've known him selling Australian wine, Spanish wine, and now back to Australian wine. But Adrian, you put a good point in the chat about how you do need to talk to different people in different ways. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess both from a consumer perspective, but also talking to the trade, I guess there's different elements to this storytelling. You know, in my current role, I do a lot of stuff with consumers, but also with the trade. And either way, it's to Joe's point, and also what Tom was saying about, you know, what I call pivoting your stories, your bank of stories, to what the audience, whether it be consumers or the trade, want to hear, and that's quite difficult. It's not just relaying that single this is my story, and the way that I do it, I tend to do an awful lot of listening. I think someone talked about that before, because that's really how you're able to understand what the consumers or the audience wants to hear, and you're just gleaning either commercial insight, you know, what is the customer's problem that they're trying to solve, what are they trying to do, what's their issues, what are their challenges, and the same with the audience. You've just got to start listening and probing and just really understanding, and then you can just use the barrage, you know, the bank of stories that you've got, just to you know, tell what you want to tell, but in a way that resonates with them. And I see it, you know, Joe's thing about the James Bond film, you know, I try and understand hooks that would be engaging. And, you know, when James Bond goes into Miss Moneypenny's office, you know, he chucks the hat on the, you know, the hat stand. That's the way I visualize it. You know, what are those hooks that are on that hat stand, and you just basically just throw the hats on top of that, and those are your stories, and that's the way I see it.
Thank you, Adrian. I think, to me, if I can just briefly chip in, I think one of the things that I think of is actually the difference between an actor who's got a script and a stand-up. And the great stand-ups actually are people who are playing off the audience. And when something's not working, they will turn off to a different direction. And I've seen bad stand-ups fail because they've come on with a set of stories they're going to tell, and they're telling UK related stories to an international audience that it doesn't relate to, and you can just see them dying on their feet. But I've seen other people, and the word we're all hearing every day at the moment, which is pivot. And I've heard people pivot brilliantly because they realize that this is getting the audience and they follow that line, or it's not getting. And I think in wine, it's one of the things I've been to many wine dinners where the man or woman at the front of the room has got the things he has to say. And he's totally oblivious to the fact that half of the audience has fallen asleep. And then he's also equally oblivious to the fact that he was saying something that they were really interested in. And he's moved off from that. And they're all too nervous or whatever to ask him to go back onto it. I'm conscious that we're quite close to our hour, our allotted hour. Can I throw the back at you, Tom Lewis, back to your advertising world? Have you got any thoughts sort of rounding some of this up?
I think on all of this, knowing your audience is key. I worked in crisis communications for a while. So a lot of the principles there are not dissimilar. So typically our clients were very large oil and gas companies run by very technical people for whom communication didn't come naturally, and they would have an industrial disaster on their hands, and they would be getting phone calls from relatives of the people involved, from the media, from the lobby groups. They'd be getting all sorts of attention. And these were very technical people who knew exactly what they were doing in terms of the engineering solution that was going to stop certain things from happening. What they didn't have necessarily, and why they brought our firm in, was because you've got a burning platform, or a platform that looks like it's going to burn, and there's people on it and you're not getting them off. And why are you not? And you need to understand who are your audience groups, who are your stakeholders, what's their point of view, what's driving them, what are their interests, and then how do I explain to them in very simple terms that they can understand, here is what I'm doing. And there were three C's of crisis communications. It was compassion, concern, and control. So I very much feel an emotional response to what's going on, and a concern for the people involved, and then a control. Here's what I'm doing about it. And those were the building blocks of a great story. And essentially that's what we were doing as crisis communication consultants, helping them build that story that's going to resonate with the different stakeholder groups. The other thing we'd say to people, and coming back to, Robert, your example of the winemaker who is telling a story, and some bits are doing really well and some bits are bombing but can't tell the difference. We'd say have 3 rocks. And the rocks were always the key points. If you're flummoxed and you don't know what to say, you just come back to, what are the 3 messages I've got to get across? And again, I suspect that's probably what stand-up comedians do. They know what's the punchline I've got to get to. And if it's working, I can draw it out. If it's not working, I'll go to the punchline and move on. So having your rocks within your story is really key as well.
Yes, things like DJs, again, they're reading the room, reading the audience. Moving back to you, Tom Parnell. Tom Parnell?
Unmute myself.
Yep.
I think I was going to say something I've completely forgotten. But yeah, there was somebody made a point a while back, I think on the chat, which I was only just reading and catching up on, but about kind of about the breadth side of things, about kind of about the best way to kind of improve storytelling. I think we've talked about kind of studying structures and kind of the shape of a good story, but from my perspective, I think often the way to improve storytelling is actually just to immerse yourself in great storytelling in a very, very different sort of verticals or not even commercial applications of storytelling. Obviously, kind of literature is one vast realm of storytelling, but kind of, I think some of the writers that I really enjoy reading are those who, they may be writing about a subject which I don't even have that much of a deep interest in, but kind of there is something about a voice of a writer, a storyteller, that kind of one can learn from and kind of learn by imitation. I think it's an area we learn best by sort of being natural to what comes to us. I think there was a point somebody made in the chat about we naturally are better at telling stories, many of us, than we think. And also just not being afraid to copy what works in other applications that are maybe far removed from wine, but kind of, you know, just stealing techniques, stealing kind of emotional riffs, whatever it is, but kind of reading widely and kind of absorbing.
Thank you. Felicity.
I agree with all of that. I do think that most people find it very hard to talk about themselves. It's why people who are even public relations agencies put out crap press releases when it's about them. And I do think whenever possible, people should get help of some kind, even if it's just help from a mate. But you know, this storytelling is becoming a very commercial enterprise. In the last few years, people have realized that storytelling is a really powerful way to market a product or to get attention. And what's that has done is it's meant that now when you tell your story, you're in a field where you're up against other people who can also tell stories, some of whom are very, very good storytellers. So I think the most important thing is be prepared. Go, and if you can afford it, get speaker training even for a weekend, get somebody to listen to your story before you go out. Get somebody else to help you work out what your story is and the best way to tell it. That's it. That's my advice.
Adrian, you're still there. So have you, what's the most successful and the least successful experience you've had in the years of storytelling for the various brands that you've been involved with?
The hardest one was actually with a well-known Spanish brand. Actually, they didn't. It was very hard to pull out. I wanted the stories. Of, you know, where was the original vineyard, whatever. I was just trying to get the stories to be in my sort of bank of stories, and they find it very hard to tell stories. It was more about, you know, it's from Rioja, it was more about the functional process, and rather than, you know, the winemaking and the aging and the grape variety. It was very functional. Ironically, it ended up being quite a successful brand, but that was hard to tease out because some people just weren't naturally thinking about stories within wine, because it was so much wedded around the process and the place and, you know, the rules. So that was the hardest. And I've just been lucky with, you know, currently with Taylor's in Australia, but, you know, Jacobs Creek and Brancott Estate, they were at the start of so many things that, you know, there's been so many stories that I was able to latch onto. So that was very, very easy to do. So I've been lucky.
Thank you for that. There's a comment to be made in the chat, which I think is very fair, which is that so many winemakers are technical people. They're often introverts, and essentially they're not necessarily out in the world where storytelling is something that comes as a daily activity, whereas perhaps salespeople, by definition, may end up doing more selling. Yeah. Joe, did you want to?
Just on that, sorry, Robert, on that, our winemaker, the other lucky thing is our winemaker loves telling stories, and the stories he has are brilliant, and he naturally just brings it back round to the product in a story rather than actually a technical description, which I just find brilliant.
Thanks for that. Joe, did you want to chip in there?
No, you know, I'm going to be terribly shameless. I mean, one of the bits is I've sort of started creating a business out of going and telling those stories, and it's been interesting seeing you know, from Polly there. It is a skill set. There is something that's of value, and there are times when I probably didn't value it very much. Just this week, twice, 3 times, I've come up with bits, and somebody said, "What would you do to that?" And I go, like that. They go, "Oh my goodness, this is amazing. That's phenomenal." But then you realise that, you know, a bit like when Tom P was there talking, you immerse yourself into it and you read lots of stories and you sit there, and there's bits that, you know, I put something up the other day. It involved Chairman Mao and what was it? T.S. Eliot and a bit of Enoch Powell, and you're grabbing bits from all over the place. Well, actually, it takes an awful long time to go and grab that much stuff all over the place and distill it without anybody noticing that you're quoting all of those people or you're being inspired there, and turning it into something that then will capture people. And you need to read the Bible a lot, because the Bible infuses most of Western communication. So you kind of need to know that inside out. You need to know most of the works of Shakespeare if you're going to tell a lot of stories, because you need to sort of know where it comes from and how it all fits. It is a skill set. is not as expensive a skill set, I think, as some people imagine.
Just going back to my little saga that I put, not saga, my little scenario I put in the chat, which I didn't think we were necessarily going to get to discuss, but we're not necessarily going to have that chance. But what, to me, as Karen Jenkins has just said, you've got to have the information. Somebody, unless somebody's come along and asked you, as you did with your guy in Greece or whatever, and we'll actually pulled the story out from them. It's always going to be difficult. Now, if I've got my little French couple who make their wine in the middle of nowhere in France, how is anybody who hasn't necessarily got your experience and skills, or anyone from the panel, going, let's say, a wine distributor? What sort of way in do you think there is? Are we talking about what is of interest to these people? Is it, back to Felicity's question, what is it that really, what is it they love? Beyond the fact I'm passionate about winemaking, what is the love? Or is it a question of what struggles they've had? Are there some key things that you would say? Let's say there's somebody who's just been taken on working in a winery, they're not necessarily experienced this. What might be the stones that they would go to lift up to look at? Any thoughts?
If I give somebody really specific sort of advice, and this is distilled from FBI negotiation and from creativity workshops and all sorts, and I would, when you speak to them, you can speak to them there or you can speak to them on the phone. The two magical words are how and what. It's never why, and it's never a closed question. So it's, how does that work? What happens then? What made you do this? How? And as they're talking, let them talk and shut up. I'm really bad at this, but leave really awkward silences, and then they'll continue. And you can play with the empathy thing. You know, there's always that thing, if somebody gets to the end of a sentence and then you just take the last three words and you go, you went to Minervois? And they go, yes, we went to Minervois, and they'll tell you something else that's extraordinary. So what I do, you sit and you listen to them and you just, how and what? How did that happen? What was that? Such and such. But never, why did you do that? It's very accusatory is why it is. Why it sort of backs people up. And never do that thing of, sounds to me like, you know, because then they go, yes. And it's totally hopeless. Yeah. Having got all that information out, you know, was it Hamish McRae used to write for The Independent, used to do this. He said, it's great being a writer because it's a bit like being at school, because you go and do all your interviews in the morning, you do sports in the afternoon, go out on a bike ride, have a run, and don't think about it. You just sort of let it all churn away. And what will emerge out of the other end, and it just sort of happens. I mean, there are things I use, Oblique Strategies, great little app. So if you're ever needing just a quirky thing, get Oblique Strategies. I think it's by Brian Eno, and it will just give you weird things, weird ways of looking at stuff, and it'll give you the dog bites man, man bites dog, little quirky twist, and then you'll start to see it comes together. And you know, then I just apply lots of basic rules. It's a bit like, you know, there's certain things. Use the word you 3 to 5 times more than you use the word I or we. It makes it relevant. Write a story about this to your aunt who isn't interested in wine. And so then he sort of turned, you know, Warren Buffett always does that. And he writes to his sister when he does his report, and he just scrubs out the name of his sister and love Warren at the bottom. And that's his investor report. And that starts to make you much more human. Now, they're long-term skills, but you know what? You could go and apply them and you'll get better at them.
I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody. I think tonight we had an absolutely brilliant session with a number of SOMs from America on Monday, I think it was it Friday or Monday? I lost track, which was extraordinary. And I think this has been one of my other absolute favorite sessions. There's been so much value in this session. We'll take the stuff from the chat and we'll put that somewhere on the website as well. This is all going to be on YouTube, and it's going to be worth watching again or listening to again, because there are so many little nuggets there. And as we've been saying in the chat, this has started so many threads of conversation. If you haven't found Tom Parnell's blog, Old Parn, P-A-R-N. It's wonderful, irreverent stuff, and it's got on the nerves of some people I'm happy it got on the nerves of, so that's great. Tom Lewis is the Cambridge wine blogger. That's right, am I right? Cambridge. Yes, and again, one of the reliable voices, and goes beyond tasting wine into cerebral stuff as well, as you can imagine. Joe Fattorini, Wine Show, live at well, not live, but doing stuff, tastings. How many times a week at the moment? 3
times a week. We're about to go back up to 4, actually.
Felicity Carter, Meininger's Wine Business International. I'm stating an interest. I'm involved with it, but a great on the web. There's a newsletter every week with lots of news, but also a great magazine. And Adrian Atkinson, you can see his little Wakefield cap, not little, but Wakefield cap beside him. Some good branding there. Good Australian wine, also known as Taylor's in some countries in the Clare Valley. And my partner in crime, Polly Hammond. And tomorrow we're doing sustainability, which should be, I think, pretty fascinating. The day after, we're doing grapes across the world, including with Randall Graham from California, who's got this extraordinary project where he's trying to grow grapes from seeds from all sorts of different grapes. And then on Monday, we're doing South Africa, which is in a dire state at the moment because the producers aren't able to ship their wine anywhere. So we've got lots coming up. So thank you for attention tonight. Please come back, please subscribe, and stay safe, if I can say it. Thank you all.
Thank you.